Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, step into the world of Anthony Corallo, the quiet and calculating boss of the Lucchese Crime Family, known as Tony Ducks, for always slipping past convictions. From the streets of East Harlem to the highest levels of the Mafia Commission, Corallo built his empire not with noise, but with careful moves and quiet influence. As you close your eyes, picture the whispered meetings, the secret alliances, and the silent power that defined his rule. Before we begin, share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach. And if you love sleeping stories of gangsters and forgotten empires, don't forget to subscribe and join our family. Now, settle in and let the silence of the night guide you deeper. Anthony Corallo was born in 1913 New York City. Raised in East Harlem among families who spoke Italian at home and learned English on the street. The neighborhood taught discipline quickly. Work was scarce in the years after the First World War, and the Great Depression pressed hard. A young man who could earn even small sums won respect, and even more if he could do it without drawing the wrong attention. He watched older boys run errands, collect small debts, shuttle envelopes, and he learned that reliable service builds trust faster than idle talk. He picked up the habits that would define him. He listened more than he spoke, he kept schedules, and he remembered who owed what. By his late teens, he was moving in the orbit of men tied to the city's underworld, especially the group that later became known as the Lucchese family. The crew's business in those days flowed through East Harlem and the garment district. Illegal betting and the numbers racket meant daily cash. Loans brought interest. Dice games and card rooms stayed busy behind the fronts of tailor shops and social clubs. A young earner who brought in steady money without disruptions rose quickly. Corallo proved useful. He showed up, counted carefully, and never flashed stacks. When police pressure rose, he faded into the background. When an older figure needed a driver or a courier, he was available and calm. The city was full of loud characters, but he stayed quiet. That quiet became a style. Prohibition ended, but money still moved through rackets that did not depend on liquor. If a merchant needed protection from thefts that conveniently stopped once a fee was paid, a crew offered the service. If a trucking company needed help avoiding delays, someone made calls to the right union steward. Relationships built in those years were made to last. Corallo learned to cultivate people who controlled things others found essential. Warehouse access, trucking routes, loading docks, union votes, and slots on job sites. By working the edges of legitimate trades, he found leverage that produced a steady flow without the heat that violent street crimes often drew. Arrests came with the territory. He was detained more than once on charges linked to gambling and the rackets that surrounded it. Yet convictions were rare. He retained skilled lawyers. He went to hearings with careful preparation. Subpoenas sometimes arrived and then somehow didn't result in testimony. He built a public image of a man who could slip past the sharpest corners of the law. From that habit came the nickname that followed him for life, Tony Ducks. Prosecutors used it, reporters printed it, and the street repeated it with a kind of wry respect. It summed up a man who avoided courtroom traps, not through bluster, but through planning. Under the leadership of Gaetano Tommy Gagliano, and later Thomas Lucchese, the organization that bore Lucchese's name favored men who kept business smooth. Corallo fit that mold. He rose through the ranks, eventually serving as a capo, overseeing a crew with interests that touched trucking, waste hauling, construction, and the garment industry. The point was not to own every truck or every cart. The point was to influence who got contracts, who received union cooperation, and who could count on supplies arriving on time. When a company resisted, there were ways to nudge it without headlines. Work slowdowns, minor delays, or the sudden discovery of contract language that required another inspection. The money came from control over friction. In the post-war years, Manhattan grew upward. Concrete poured into high rises, the garment district pulsed, and the piers and airports became gateways for cargo. Corallo's circle saw opportunity. If a union local controlling crane operators or concrete delivery sided with a particular contractor, deadlines were met. If not, delays widened. The arrangement brought in regular payments, often disguised as consulting fees or hidden inside inflated invoices. He did not boast about it. He preferred simple offices and unmarked doors. He took meetings in diners, construction sites, and back tables where noise from kitchens masked words. He avoided the kind of splash that drew a front-page photograph. His legal troubles gathered at intervals. In the early 1960s, he was convicted on bribery charges, tied to a New York City public official. That conviction led to a federal prison term, one of the few times he actually served time behind bars. Even in that setback, his reputation for patience held. He did not complain publicly. He completed his sentence and returned to his routines. Law enforcement kept watch, documenting his contacts with figures in and around the Lucchese organization. Investigators linked him to labor racketeering in the garment center, trucking at the airports, and waste carting firms that held sway over commercial trash routes on Long Island and in the outer boroughs. The paper trail was often thin, but the pattern seemed clear to agents who tracked meetings, money flows, and union votes that broke in predictable directions. Tommy Lucchese died in 1967. The family's leadership shifted to Carmine Tramonti, a veteran figure who soon faced major narcotics charges, known collectively as the French Connection case. Those charges, brought by federal authorities, pointed to a large heroin pipeline that fed New York. Tramonti's conviction in the early 1970s left the family in need of a new leader. Anthony Corallo emerged as the choice, widely recognized by his peers as a steady hand. In 1973, he became the boss of the Lucchese family, and he set about organizing the enterprise in the businesslike way that matched his own habits. He appointed reliable lieutenants. Salvatore Santoro, a man with deep ties to unions and airport operations, served as underboss. Christopher Christie Tick Fernari, an experienced mediator and strategist, took the role of consigliere. Crews under them handled day-to-day earnings from loan sharking, illegal gambling, and the network of labor rackets that touched trucking, construction, and waste carting. According to investigators, the family exerted influence over Teamsters locals at the airports, steered contracts in the garment district, and received payments from contractors seeking trouble-free jobs at major building sites. These payments were not made with receipts pinned on a bulletin board. They moved through cash deliveries, sham consulting arrangements, and padded invoices. The money kept coming because the service delivered results. Work moved, and those who paid avoided costly, unexplained slowdowns. He resisted the flashier rackets. Federal wiretaps and informant accounts later suggested that Corallo discouraged members from dealing in narcotics, which drew severe penalties and relentless scrutiny. He favored rackets that could blend into legitimate commerce. He developed a habit of holding key conversations in moving vehicles rather than rooms that might hide microphones. He used car phones early, a novelty at the time, and rotated vehicles. The intent was clear: avoid bugs, avoid careless words, avoid any scene that could be photographed and splashed across a paper. During his rule, his family joined other New York organizations in shaping the construction economy. Prosecutors later argued that a club of concrete companies linked to organized crime controlled who won large pours in Manhattan, with major families taking a cut of profits. Lucchese management under Corallo, they said, had a seat at that table. The scheme, according to trial evidence years later, involved bid rigging and extortion masked as labor, peace. He was not the only figure in that arena, and his name rarely appeared on paper. But his leadership put him in the center of decisions that moved millions. At John F. Kennedy International Airport, investigators documented a long-running pattern of theft and extortion around cargo terminals. The Lucchese family had influence there, they said, through union locals and foremen who controlled access. If a shipper wanted safe passage for valuable goods, a quiet fee ensured it. If a worker caused problems, he found himself reassigned. Santoro's crew specialized in that sphere, while Corallo supervised from a remove. This was not about dramatic heists that made the news. It was a system that skimmed the edges of commerce day after day in amounts that added up. He also maintained interests in the private carting business, a world where routes and customers often fell under the sway of trade associations that functioned, in practice, as gatekeepers. Businesses that paid the set rate kept their service. Those who tried to switch haulers faced pressure. With allies like Salvatore Avellino, a Long Island-based capo, the family held leverage over commercial trash pickup in parts of the city and suburbs. Decades later, civil lawsuits and municipal reforms would dismantle much of that system. But in Corallo's era, it generated healthy returns with relatively low risk of immediate scandal. Despite the pressure that came with being a boss, he kept his public life muted. He avoided nightclubs known for celebrity sightings, stood clear of cameras, and rarely raised his voice in public. He preferred to be the person others reported to rather than the one cutting ribbons at a banquet. In meetings, he listened, let his underlings summarize their problems, and then gave decisions that emphasized steady income over dramatic moves. He rewarded men who kept arrests to a minimum and who handled disputes without generating headlines. His approach made the family dependable to those who paid for services and frustrating to investigators who craved spectacle. That calm could not insulate him from the growing strength of federal racketeering laws. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act gave prosecutors tools to tie together patterns of criminal acts using wiretaps, informants, and financial records to show an enterprise at work. Through the late 70s and into the 80s, surveillance of Corallo's circle tightened. Agents watched restaurants, followed cars, and noted the patterns of meetings that moved across boroughs. Corallo adapted. He shifted to car-based talks and kept his circle tight, often traveling with Avellino behind the wheel and Fernari at his side. He believed a moving target was harder to bug. He had kept out of legal traps for decades with careful habits. That confidence, built over a lifetime, led him to a mistake that would end his reign. In the early 1980 seconds, the FBI managed to place a concealed microphone in his Jaguar, a sleek ride that matched his preference for quiet comfort. The device turned his own precaution talking while cruising the Belt Parkway, the Long Island Expressway, and back roads into the government's advantage. The recordings captured him discussing the family's interests, the influence in unions, and the coordination with leaders of other New York families. Federal agents listened as he assessed who could be trusted, how bids were arranged, and what payments were expected in return for labor peace. The material, later presented in court, formed a spine for a sweeping case that aimed not just at one family, but at the governing body known as the Commission, the informal council, through which the city's major families resolved disputes and divided spheres of influence. All the while, the man at the center kept the same tone he had used since East Harlem. Calm, deliberate, unemotional. To him, this was business, refined over decades. To law enforcement, it was a blueprint of criminal enterprise. The collision between those views would define the next chapter of his life, when the recordings that hummed through his own car speakers would be replayed before a judge, his careful voice becoming evidence. The wire in the Jaguar was not just a device. It was the hinge on which an era swung from shadow to courtroom. From whispered plans to sworn testimony, the tape from the Jaguar spooled for months, a steady stream of calm exchanges about contracts, union calendars, and which companies would find projects smooth if they respected long-standing arrangements. It was the sound of habits built over decades. No raised voices, no chest health humping, only practical talk about which foreman could be trusted, which bid should land where, and how to keep job sites moving. Agents listening in windowless rooms mapped every name to photos, traced plate numbers, and stitched together a chart of relationships that linked loading docks, concrete plants, airport cargo bays, carding firms, and social clubs. The result was not a single incident, but an outline of a system that had grown with the city itself. By then, the country had new legal tools that let prosecutors pull patterns into a single story. RICO allowed them to frame a case not around one shakedown or one payoff, but around an enterprise. A council known as the Commission had long served as a way for New York's dominant families to coordinate. It was not a building with an address. It was a method regular understandings on territory, percentages, and peace. As head of the Lucchese family, Corallo had a recognized seat at that table, a quiet vote on matters that kept money flowing and tempers contained. That structure, described for years in whispers and press speculation, would soon be set out in a federal indictment. In early 1985, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan unveiled a sweeping case aimed at the Commission itself. The strategy was bold: bring the city's senior figures into one courtroom and show jurors how bid rigging, labor racketeering, and the flow of illegal bets tied the five families together. Names familiar to crime reporters appeared on the charging papers alongside union officials and intermediaries. Corallo, his underboss Salvatore Santoro, and consigliere Christopher Fernari were among the defendants accused of running the Lucchese enterprise through extortion, fraud, and manipulation of unions in the construction and transportation trades. Reporters clustered outside courthouses. Cameras caught gray suits and guarded eyes. Years of slow investigation had ripened. Arrests followed the unsealing of the charges. Plain sedans rolled up to homes and small offices. Corallo's manner stayed even. He had stood in front of judges before and believed in preparation. Hire seasoned counsel, challenge the most damaging pieces of evidence, and rely on the patience that had earned him his nickname. Bail was set with conditions. Meetings that once took place on highways now had to be filtered through attorney rooms and guarded conversations. Even then, he tried to keep his people steady, reminding them that routine and loyalty were shields when tension rose. Defense lawyers attacked the government's recordings, arguing that the placement and use of the device violated rights, and that the snippets were contextual, not criminal. Prosecutors countered that the wire captured exactly what it seemed to capture: a leader discussing how to steer bids, collect payments for labor peace, and align with other bosses on rules of engagement. A federal judge, after hearings, allowed the lion's share of the tapes. The defense won a few limits on phrasing and exhibits. The core evidence stayed in. The stage was set for a marathon trial in a Manhattan courtroom, where rows of jurors would spend months listening, diagramming, and learning a secret vocabulary of construction, trucking, and union politics. Inside that courtroom, the public saw the inner workings of racketeering delivered not as legend, but as ledger. Witnesses explained how a concrete supplier with the right backers landed big pours on high U-profile buildings, while competitors were kept to smaller jobs. Union officials testified about off-with-the-books payments for timely deliveries, smooth inspections, and peaceful job sites. Investigators traced meetings that linked airport cargo supervisors with Lucchese intermediaries to ensure that valuable shipments moved without mix-ups. The Jaguar tapes dropped. Corallo's understated voice into the mix, discussing who was reliable, which bids belonged to which circle, and how to address infractions without attracting attention. The government's narrative included the so-called Concrete Club, an informal ring of favored companies that, according to testimony, divvied up major projects and paid assessments to the families in exchange for protection from slowdowns and wildcat actions. It was not as simple as envelopes on tables. The money often traveled through false consulting agreements, overbilled change orders, or padded subcontracting lines. At airports, jurors heard about crews who controlled access to high-value cargo areas. A fee meant fewer, misplaced items. The garment district brought its own pattern. Trucking routes favored by certain shops, warehouses where delays mysteriously vanished, and no-show jobs that padded payrolls for friends of the house. Corallo had always avoided the image of a street boss. He did not swagger, and he did not grant reporters barn-burner quotes. That restraint now worked in two ways. In front of jurors, he looked like a businessman in his 70s, walking slowly, conferring in hushed tones with counsel. On the recordings, he sounded like a manager, delegating rather than threatening. Prosecutors used that to argue that modern organized crime had moved far from tavern brawls. This was managerial control over labor, logistics, and contracting, they said. A quiet pressure that bent markets. The defense pressed back. Business talk is not crime, they insisted, and prosecutors were overreaching by treating ordinary associations as conspiracy. Midway through, the trial felt less like a drama than a class in industrial New York. Carpenters, teamsters, concrete drivers, dock workers, office managers, and estimators took the stand. Each described a narrow piece of daily life: how trucks were dispatched, who called when loads needed rerouting, what a steward did when a contractor fell behind. Viewed alone, none of it shocked. Layered together, and tied to cash deliveries and recorded calls, the picture was what the government wanted jurors to see: a pattern of control. In that picture, the Lucchese family under Corallo played a defined role, focusing on transportation, building trades, and service contracts that touched thousands of workers and hundreds of businesses. When closing arguments arrived in the fall of 1986, both sides leaned on their strengths. The government replayed excerpts from the Jaguar, pointed to the paper flow, and reminded jurors that the case did not hinge on a single threat but on a coordinated system. The defense highlighted gaps, questioned informant motives, and urged jurors to separate story from proof. After days of deliberation, the panel returned across the board guilty verdicts on the major racketeering counts. It was a thunderclap moment in the history of organized crime prosecutions. The commission case had landed with force. Sentencing came with the weight of a new era. The court imposed severe terms designed to cripple the leadership structure. Corallo received a century in federal prison, alongside heavy fines. For a man who had spent a lifetime dodging extended incarceration, the message could not have been clearer. He was in his early 70s. Appeals followed, as expected. But the core judgment stood. Those years would not be coming back. The federal system moved him among high-security facilities, places built to handle long-term prisoners who were still considered influential. Visits were monitored, calls were limited, and mail moved at a measured pace. Even with those limits, influence does not vanish overnight. Corallo tried to preserve order by arranging succession. Trusted Brooklyn figures rose. Vittorio Amuso, a capo with a reputation for discipline and caution, and Anthony Casso, a driven strategist with deep ties in construction and union circles. Messages traveled through lawyers and family members. The instruction was simple: keep earning, avoid wasteful showdowns, and preserve the rackets that had kept the organization steady for years. He believed management could be taught, that the habits learned in East Harlem and matured in mid-century Manhattan would outlast his physical presence. The world outside his cell did not stay still. New prosecutors followed new leads from the commission case, targeting specific sectors with fresh indictments. Carting associations that fixed rates, airport locals where theft had become systemic, and construction rings that siphoned money from city housing repairs and window replacement contracts. Some of these cases reached back into networks shaped during his tenure, even if they did not name him directly because he was already serving a life-equivalent term. The point for law enforcement was to dismantle the infrastructure, not just jail one generation of bosses. Reforms in city contracting, changes in union leadership, and newly emboldened task forces put more pressure on the old ways. Behind bars, Corallo kept to routines that mirrored the discipline he had cultivated outside. Exercise at set times, reading, quiet conversations with a small circle, attention to health as age advanced. He was not given to jailhouse theatrics or interviews designed to recast his legend. The nickname that once sounded like a boast ducking subpoenas and charges no longer fit. There was nothing left to dodge. In letters, he urged patience and caution, but the undercurrents in the organization were already shifting. Younger men, brought up in a different climate, had their own ideas about pace and force. For the city, the commission verdict changed the psychological landscape. Builders began to treat off-the-books costs as risks rather than inevitabilities. Some unions cleaned house, installing leadership less open to side deals. At the airports, increased security and oversight made casual theft more difficult. The networks that had given the Lucchese family leverage in the garment district shrank as the industry itself moved and as enforcement intensified. What had looked permanent in the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds turned out to be susceptible to sustained legal pressure. That did not erase corruption, but it reduced the predictability that had made the system profitable. Corallo's legacy, viewed through court records and agency files, is a study in quiet control. He specialized in rackets that hid inside necessary services, where one phone call from a steward could cost a contractor thousands or save a week on a schedule. Gambling and loans brought in steady income, but the real leverage lay in labor and logistics. That was the core of his career, and the reason why the Jaguar recordings mattered. They captured a manager discussing influence with the ease of long practice. Years after the jury foreman read out the guilty verdicts, those tapes remained a symbol of how a cautious operator could be undone not by a flamboyant mistake, but by an invisible microphone catching a tone of ordinary authority. The sentence turned a long life into one largely measured in institutional routines. From time to time, news of appeals or prison movements reached the papers, and his name surfaced again, usually accompanied by stock photos and a summary of the commission trial. He rarely responded publicly. Without the old travel and constant meetings, his world narrowed to visits, messages passed through counsel, and the steady rhythm of an aging man in federal custody. Outside, successors tested new lines and revived old ones, sometimes sticking to the measured style he had praised, sometimes breaking from it in ways that drew heat. The years after the verdict settled into a rhythm of steel doors and scheduled calls, but the story that brought Anthony Corallo to that point, the stretched back across a half-century of quiet influence. He had not built his reputation on spectacle. He had assembled it out of patient relationships in places where the city did its daily work: loading docks, dispatch offices, union halls, and the small back rooms of trade associations. To understand why the Jaguar tapes carried weight, it helps to see how the habits on those recordings were learned, one favor at a time, long before he became a boss. As a young earner, he had learned to think in terms of functions, not headlines. The garment district needed trucks that arrived on time and didn't mysteriously break down. A tailor with 3 dozen employees could be knocked off schedule by a single delay in supplies. Corallo and his mentors treated that vulnerability as currency. If a shop owner wanted reliability, a friendly hauler got the account, and a union delegate ensured nothing on the dock went missing. The payments that followed were framed as dues, fees, or consulting retainers. In practice, they were premiums for calm. He watched older figures show up at 6 a.m. to shake hands with overnight foremen, and he learned that the person who could unjam a stalled loading bay at dawn held more power than the one who offered big talk at midnight. During the 1,940 seconds and 1,950 seconds, the city's economy grew, and with it the web of labor locals that kept trucks moving, elevators operating, and cement pouring. Corallo gained responsibility in that web, gradually supervising a crew whose income came from betting, loans, and, increasingly, the leverage that came with labor peace. A key lesson was that control did not require constant coercion. It required predictability. Stewards and business agents who owed favors would make a call when a contractor tried to switch suppliers without clearing it. A shipping foreman might place a new hire who could be trusted to keep the right people briefed. Rarely did he put his name on anything. He let paperwork list companies and middlemen while he stayed a step removed, checking numbers and giving direction in short phrases. Arrests came and went, tied to gambling or suspected interference with union decisions. Courtrooms saw him often enough, but he avoided long stints behind bars. His nickname followed him because judges dismissed, juries hung, or prosecutors couldn't tie him cleanly to the money. He understood procedure, knew when to stay silent, and always hired representation with experience in complicated cases. The impression took hold. He was steady, methodical, not prone to rash moves. That image helped when he negotiated with rivals. Men who dealt in flash and fury eventually stumbled. Men who kept a schedule could sit at more tables because others believed they would not bring chaos. The early 1,960 seconds brought one of the few decisive legal setbacks he ever faced. Federal prosecutors charged him in a bribery scheme involving a New York City commissioner responsible for water and power. Investigators tracked payments that, they argued, were aimed at steering municipal decisions and securing advantage for connected service vendors. He was convicted and served a substantial federal term. Even then, the public part of his life remained restrained. He did his time without fanfare and returned to familiar surroundings. If anything, the experience hardened his preference for unseen influence. From that point on, he favored even tighter circles, more car rides, fewer sit-downs in rooms that could be wired. By the late 1,960 seconds, the family he served was shifting. Tommy Lucchese's death had opened a period of uncertainty. Carmine Tramunti held the leadership for a time, but his name became tangled in a major narcotics case that brought intense federal heat. After Tramunti's conviction, the organization looked for a leader with a more business-like approach, someone who could stabilize crews that earned through betting and labor rackets while discouraging ventures likely to draw sensational headlines. Corallo fit that requirement. His appointment in 1973 signaled a focus on industries where money moved constantly: construction, trucking, airport freight, and private carting. He set his team early. Salvatore Santoro, an organizer with deep reach in airport locals, became underboss. Christopher Christie Tick Fernari took the consigliere role, respected as a mediator who knew how to weigh competing interests without inflaming them. Beneath them sat captains who controlled crews in the garment center, on Long Island, in the Bronx, and around Queens. That structure did not guarantee smooth sailing. It did, however, give him channels to enforce his preferences. Keep the streets quiet, treat labor as leverage rather than a weapon, and seek predictable returns from essential services. Air cargo offered one of the clearest examples of that method. The explosion of international trade moved high-value freight through JFK and other terminals. Control over unions tied to freight forwarders, ramp services, and warehouse crews meant persistent leverage. Investigators later documented a pattern. Companies that paid service fees saw fewer walkouts and quicker resolutions to staffing disputes. Those that balked encountered sudden problems, lost paperwork, extended inspections, or trucks that waited while a steward processed other deliveries first. Santoro's knowledge of key locals gave the family a reliable income stream from that sector. The sums were not always spectacular in a single day, but over months and years the returns were steady, and the risk of tabloid-style scandal was lower than with armed robberies. The garment district followed a similar script. Trucking firms competed for routes that served clusters of factories and showrooms. A favored carrier landed the most profitable circuits and, in turn, paid to keep that advantage. Warehouse time slots, overtime approvals, and hiring lists could all be tilted in small ways that added up to big differences in profit. If a factory owner considered switching carriers to shave costs, a union delegate might warn of staffing issues, or a supervisor might discover a safety concern that needed an extra day to review. Nothing dramatic, just friction that made the cheaper choice less attractive. Corallo didn't have to direct each move. He built a culture in which lieutenants understood the boundaries. Be firm, be calm, be invisible. Private carding became another pillar. The city's commercial trash business had long relied on long-withstanding customer relationships. Trade groups that looked legitimate on paper acted, in reality, as enforcement arms for property rights, an unwritten code that assigned customers to particular haulers. Business owners paid fixed rates and avoided trouble. When a rival hauler tried to poach accounts, trucks might find themselves blocked by union pickets, or a foreman might decide that a loading dock was unavailable due to scheduling conflicts. With allies like Salvatore Avellino in the suburbs, the Lucchese crews collected regular payments while keeping direct threats out of sight. Years later, civil lawsuits and city reforms would expose and dismantle much of that system, tracing its roots back through a period when Corallo's leadership kept it humming. Construction brought the highest stakes. Large concrete jobs in Manhattan were gold mines, and the families recognized that open competition could lead to expensive conflicts. According to testimony in later trials, a ring of favored concrete suppliers emerged, understood to be members, who would rotate the biggest pours and pay assessments in exchange for labor peace. Union officials overseeing cement and rebar crews, along with contacts in building trades, formed the practical backbone of that arrangement. Under Corallo, the Lucchese family protected its share with a managerial touch. Meetings set prices and schedules. Disputes were referred to sit-downs rather than left to stewards on the ground to hash out angrily. That approach suited other bosses because it reduced the risk that a single hothead would derail a multi-million-dollar project. Not every famous event from that era ran through him directly. In 1978, a notorious cargo robbery at an airport made national news and was later immortalized in film. It was engineered by a crew under a different captain within the Lucchese family. While it happened on his watch, law enforcement never established that he planned it. If anything, that kind of splash was exactly what he discouraged. He wanted airports to be reliable machines that generated steady income, not scenes for spectacular thefts that would bring a swarm of agents to every terminal. Yet he understood that crews needed to feel like earners, so he balanced discipline with tolerance for ventures that did not threaten the larger engine of labor influence. His personal style remained consistent. He kept a home life out of view, used a limited set of restaurants, and preferred sedans with powerful engines to nondescript offices. He liked car phones at a time when they were status symbols, and he rotated vehicles like other men rotated suits. That habit was meant to frustrate surveillance. It worked for years. The decision to trust a particular Jaguar with private conversations changed that calculus. And once federal agents gained access to its innards, they turned his own taste for mobility into a surveillance platform. The clarity of those recordings, and the way they mapped onto a broader pattern of influence, allowed prosecutors to present a picture in court that connected dots across industries without relying solely on informants. After the commission case, and after he was moved into high-security custody, he tried to keep order through messages sent by attorneys and approved visitors. He blessed a leadership arrangement that elevated Vittorio Amuso and Anthony Casso. The instruction he gave was in keeping with his lifelong ethos. Keep the money regular, avoid pointless war, and treat unions as partners whose goodwill could be priced. But once leadership passes to men with their own instincts, style shifts. New prosecutions hammered airport locals, concrete suppliers, and municipal contracting scams, including a city window replacement scheme that traced its methods to the same blend of bid steering and labor leverage perfected in earlier decades. The landscape he had shaped was being torn apart piece by piece. Prison life reduced his world to routines, but he stayed disciplined. He exercised, watched his diet, and used reading to keep his mind from dulling. Age brought its own limits, and medical units became more regular stops. He did not seek interviews or memoir deals. He seemed to understand that the story was already written in court transcripts, surveillance logs, and the daily operations of a city that had, for a long time, baked side agreements into its concrete and carting. To the end, he spoke in the same manner that had marked him on the street: measured, controlled, never theatrical. Looking back from that vantage point, his career is a study in managerial racketeering. He specialized in bending necessary systems, trucking routes, waste collection, cargo handling, concrete delivery, without breaking them. He prized steady percentages over spikes, trust over intimidation, quiet over attention. The crimes tied to his name in indictments and trials were not isolated. They were threads in a fabric that wrapped itself around daily commerce. When the Jaguar yielded its secrets, it wasn't the revelation of a hidden tyrant. It was the unmasking of a supervisor going over schedules and shares in a tone that felt like any other business meeting. That was both the strength of his method and, in the end, the evidence that undid it. The city changed as he aged. Manufacturing moved, enforcement improved, and public tolerance for backroom costs shrank. Some of those shifts were driven by cases that began with his recorded words. Others sprang from economic currents no one boss could control. He remained what he had been since his early days in East Harlem. A presence that preferred order. A broker who valued systems more than stunts. A man who believed that if trucks arrived on time and labor stayed calm, money would find its way to him. For decades it did. Then the law found a way to translate ordinary-sounding management into a criminal map. The voice that once organized calm became a soundtrack for a conviction, and the world outside his cell rolled on without him, noisier, less predictable, and far beyond the reach of his patient phone calls. Age has a way of narrowing a man's circle, and in federal custody, the circle is mostly memory, old routines, and news clipped from papers that arrive a day or two late. Anthony Corallo followed those clippings closely. They told him how the world he had shaped was being pulled apart by cases set in motion while he was still riding the highways with a car phone pressed to his ear. The headlines were not just about the commission verdict. They tracked the slow unwinding of networks he had helped stitch together across the building trades, trucking, airport freight, and private carting. You could see the lines back to earlier years, to decisions made in rooms without microphones, to a management style that favored leverage over spectacle. One line ran through New Jersey. Long before the commission case, he had backed the rise of a sturdy satellite built by Anthony Tumac Etc. and Michael Taxeta. They organized gambling, loans, and labor contacts west of the Hudson, with a blend of independence and tribute that fit Corallo's temperament. He understood that a crew that felt trusted would produce more and complain less. The Jersey operation earned through bookmaking on sports, numbers, games, and steady loan revenue, and they wove themselves into unions tied to trucking and light industry. They handled disputes with meetings rather than noise. Money arrived on schedule. For years, that arrangement was a model of what he liked, a stable revenue source that didn't splash across front pages. State investigators eventually built a broad racketeering case against that New Jersey wing. It became a marathon trial, a test of a state RICO statute that mirrored the federal tool used in Manhattan. Jurors heard months of testimony about betting ledgers, payrolls padded with no-show jobs, and the way municipal contracts could be tilted by quiet pressure. When the long proceeding ended with acquittals for the key defendants, it stunned prosecutors. For Corallo, reading about it from a cell, the verdict felt like a validation of a method: keep violence out of sight, keep records careful, rely on trust. But law enforcement did not shrug and go home. They recalibrated. New cases would focus on construction rings, airport theft, and city procurement schemes that had been perfected in the years when his counsel set the tone. Another radio line from the past ran through an infamous airport theft in 1978. A Lufthansa cargo vault yielded millions in cash and jewelry. The robbery was engineered by a Queens crew that belonged to the Lucchese family through a captain who had grown powerful on loan sharking and hijacking. It was not Corallo's style to greenlight such a splash, and no court ever proved that he approved or planned it. Even so, it unfolded under his watch and brought heat to terminals he preferred to keep calm. In the years after, a swirl of disappearances and arrests surrounded figures tied to the theft. The case entered pop culture, casting a long shadow that distracted from the quieter, more lucrative business of labor influence that he prized. He learned the lesson early and repeated it often. If the public hears about it, the profit curve dips. Through the early 1980 seconds, his family's place in the city's economic machinery remained defined by labor. Teamsters locals at the airports were a constant focus, as were unions tied to ready-to-mix plants and rebar work. Contacts in those spheres could make or unmake a contractor's week. Prosecutors would later argue, using the Jaguar recordings and witness testimony, that Corallo's direction turned those contacts into structured schemes. Bid steering in concrete, assessments on big pours, and fees for peace that allowed high-profile projects to meet deadlines. On Long Island and in the outer boroughs, private carting added a reliable stream, with trade associations functioning as gatekeepers. None of it looked dramatic to an outsider. To participants, it meant the difference between a frantic phone call at 5 a.m. and a job that started on time. When the commission case ended with a 100-year sentence, he faced the problem every long-serving boss tries to solve: succession. Before arrests, he had already elevated people he trusted, Salvatore Santoro and Christopher Fernari, on the Leadership Council, and strong earners in Brooklyn, Queens, and Long Island. With Santoro and Fernari also sentenced, he signaled support for Vittorio Amuso and Anthony Casso to assume day-to-day command. The guidelines he sent out through attorneys and family were familiar. Avoid reckless moves. Stay with labor and service rackets. Grow the carting base. Keep airports smooth. But leadership is not a baton that passes without wobble. The next chapter took a different tone. As the late 1980 seconds turned into the early 1990 seconds, federal and city authorities launched targeted cases against construction fraud and trade waste. A notable example was the Windows investigation, which alleged that 4 families had cooperated to fix prices and steer contracts for city housing projects. The scheme, as described in indictments and trials, echoed the logic of the concrete club: divide work, keep labor steady, and collect percentages. The Lucchese family's fingerprints, investigators said, were visible through contractors and union contacts first cultivated in Corallo's time. Convictions in those cases weakened the system of guaranteed margins and made it harder to promise a developer that an envelope would buy predictability. Carting, long a quiet pillar, drew special attention from the Manhattan District Attorney and the city's trade waste regulators. Civil suits and criminal cases chipped away at the property rights code that held customers in place. Salvatore Avellino, a longtime ally who had stewarded routes and prices across parts of Long Island and Queens, was indicted and later pleaded to charges tied to the industry. City reforms created oversight commissions with the power to bar firms from contracts if they were linked to organized crime figures. Those changes struck at an arrangement that had endured for decades and had been a signature of Corallo's income plan: steady, long-term, low-drama fees for necessary service. Inside the Lucchese ranks, the calm he had prized gave way to internal strain. Amuso and Casso demanded higher payments and grew suspicious of the New Jersey faction Corallo had once praised for disciplined earning. Orders went out that pushed people into hiding. A climate of fear replaced the steady cadence of tribute and sit-downs. In that atmosphere, key insiders flipped. Alphonse Darco, who had served as acting boss for a time, became a government witness and offered detailed accounts of meetings, structures, and revenue streams dating back to Corallo's years. Another seasoned figure, Peter Chiodo, cooperated after a failed attempt on his life, telling agents about concrete schemes, union leverage, and arrangements at the airports. Their testimony helped prosecutors map how the enterprise functioned when Corallo sat at the top. Those accounts, combined with the Jaguar tapes, shaped public understanding of Corallo's approach. He was described by witnesses as measured, skeptical of narcotics ventures, focused on rackets that blended with legitimate trades. They detailed how he considered price points for peace at job sites, how he weighed which companies could be trusted to honor commitments, and how he preferred disputes to be resolved by sit-downs rather than street incidents. In courtrooms, that tone undercut the stereotype of the noisy, volatile boss and replaced it with a portrait that looked more like a board chairman for a network of shadow companies tied to unions and vendors. The crimes were in the method itself: steering bids, controlling access, extracting payments through the promise of smooth labor relations. Appeals ran their course. His lawyers challenged the admissibility of the recordings, argued that the RICO frameworks were overbroad, and questioned venue and jury instructions. The Second Circuit affirmed the convictions, and higher courts declined further review. Transfers carried him from one federal facility to another, eventually landing him in a medical center as age pressed down. The daily routine of prison life, early counts, scheduled recreation, monitored calls, replaced the daily circuit of meetings that had defined his adulthood. He asked after old acquaintances and followed the fall of men who once seemed untouchable. The names changed, but the pattern did not. Get used to a system, and the system changes, or the law adjusts to catch up. What stood out, even in confinement, was how often agencies returned to the same sectors he had prioritized. New airport rules tightened access and auditing around cargo. Unions instituted oversight to reduce unsanctioned side deals. The construction industry adopted compliance programs and new layers of inspection. None of it guaranteed purity, but it complicated the kind of quiet calibrations that Corallo had relied on for half a century. Where once a steward's call could end a slowdown, now an internal monitor might ask for documentation, and a contractor's lawyer might flag risky off-the-books arrangements. The city had learned from the cases built on his era. To younger men who came up after him, his name carried a certain weight. Even rivals acknowledged that he turned influence into income without the kind of scenes that make front pages. That reputation did not spare him the longest sentence of his life, and it did not prevent the collapse of the order he had curated. But it left a template. When investigators later debriefed new cooperators, they heard echoes of his directives. Keep disputes quiet. Treat labor as leverage. Avoid drug cases. Don't flaunt wealth. Prefer long-term streams over one-time scores. Those lines had been drilled into crews for decades. Set side by side with bank records and recordings, they became evidence rather than guidance. He grew older in that medical unit, his world reduced to checkups, modest meals, simple exercise, and the occasional visit. He never published an account or sought to recast his story. He understood that his life would be told by the paperwork generated by others: surveillance logs, grand jury transcripts, affidavits, plea agreements, and the official likeness of his voice captured by a microphone hidden under leather and chrome. The city outside moved on: new towers, new airport terminals, new sanitation contracts, new faces arguing about old problems. In those changes was the trace of a career that had once dictated who poured concrete where and who picked up which dumpster on what day. There is a certain symmetry in how it all lands. He had built a style meant to avoid records, talk in cars, move the locus of decision from conference rooms to cruising lanes, keep names out of ledgers. The tape in the Jaguar turned that very avoidance into a file thicker than any ledger. It gave jurors a tone to hear, a cadence to match to charts, a way to understand how a legally invisible pressure could make a city bend. From East Harlem errands to a federal medical ward, the arc is clear. A manager of hidden systems whose success depended on staying boring to the public became, in the end, a case study. The quiet became the headline. The same patience that took him up the ladder kept him steady in a cell as news arrived that the systems he built were being dismantled, one oversight rule at a time. Years before the steel doors and medical callouts, he had watched the city learn his world's vocabulary in public. The early 1960 seconds brought televised hearings where insiders described ranks, rules, and the idea of a governing council. Reporters repeated terms that had once lived only in back rooms. That period also overlapped with his own conviction for bribery tied to a city official, a break in his habit of skating past charges. He served his time, returned to familiar streets, and leaned even harder into low visibility rackets that fused with necessary services. When the public looked for lurid scenes, he gave them none. He put his effort into places where a clipboard and a timesheet mattered as much as a threat ever did. Through the late 1950 seconds and early 1960 seconds, a famous gathering upstate had already alerted police to the scale of national coordination. Raids and lists gave agencies a starting roster, and attention across the Northeast intensified. Corallo adjusted by simplifying his patterns. He cut the number of places he visited, shrank the circle that had direct access, and let trusted crews act with more autonomy so long as money arrived on a timetable. He cared less about dominance than about predictability. If a rival crew wanted a particular slice of gambling in a neighborhood, he preferred a sit-down and a cut over a feud that would chill the cash flow in every direction. That patience, sharpened across decades, made him a natural choice for top leadership once the older guard faded and a steady hand was needed. As boss, he spent little energy on public show. He rarely posed for photos at social clubs and avoided flashy banquets that made the evening news. His interest lay in the way unions shaped commerce. Airport freight depended on locals that scheduled ramp crews, warehouse shifts, and truck loading. Concrete jobs required coordination among batch plants, drivers, and trades that set forms and rebar. Private carting lived on route stability and business customers who preferred not to think about trash once it left the curb. He put lieutenants in those corridors and expected them to keep tempers low and revenue constant. The approach worked because it exploited the city's need to keep moving. A day saved on a construction schedule meant money for a developer. A resolved staffing snag at a cargo terminal meant fewer claims and better insurance rates. He made those practical wins his product. By the 1970 seconds, he had refined a system of quiet enforcement. The signals were subtle. A steward's call, a delay in issuing overtime, a reminder about a clause in a collective agreement. Most people who felt the nudge never saw his face. They dealt with a business agent, a foreman, or a consultant who promised smoother days ahead. The money that followed often carried legitimate labels, labor relations, advice, expediting, site coordination. In that distance lay safety. He reviewed results through brief reports and short conversations while on the move. If a name surfaced in the press, he stepped back and let time cool the surface before resuming where he left off. The city grew and shifted, and his crews adapted with it. As manufacturing thinned in Manhattan, the garment trade contracted or moved. New towers demanded massive pours, creating leverage for those who could guarantee crews would be on site and cement trucks wouldn't sit blocked 3 blocks away. The so-called concrete rotation that prosecutors later described was born out of that need to keep peace among suppliers and keep money reliable for families that policed the edges. Corallo accepted the logic: rotate major jobs among club members, keep bids controlled, and require payments in return for smooth labor. It was a business plan framed in the language of union calendars and delivery windows. Back at the airports, contacts in Teamster locals were an engine. Forwarders who shipped high-value goods wanted crews who could handle loads quickly, with minimal loss. A discreet fee became a form of insurance. When cases did surface pallets light, cartons opened, crews were shuffled, and problems faded. Those results kept customers paying and kept the system below the threshold that would have brought sweeping raids every week. Corallo measured success not by a headline, but by the absence of one. He understood that glitz was a tax. When a famous heist drew attention, patrols surged. Federal task forces multiplied, and once easy favors took longer. He never bragged about keeping crews away from flashy robberies. He simply conditioned his people to prefer the recurring revenue of labor peace over the one-time jolt of a score. The famous airport robbery in the late 1970 seconds had not been his design, and it annoyed him because it brought heat to terminals that, in his mind, were supposed to be dependable machines. The aftermath confirmed his view. Months of scrutiny, lots of noise, and less income. The cases that felled him in the 1980 seconds used a tool built for patterns rather than single events. RICO allowed prosecutors to draw a line through concrete contracts, union influence, and recurring payments, and to call that line an enterprise directed by bosses meeting under the umbrella of a commission. The recordings from his car gave those patterns a voice. In court, the material sounded like a manager's meeting, not a threat. But paired with witnesses who explained the effect of each arrangement, it met the statute's definition of extortion and fraud tied to an ongoing organization. He had been careful. The law had become more systematic. After the verdict and the long sentence, he returned to discipline, this time within a prison routine. He woke early, walked laps in whatever yard or corridor access allowed, and kept his mind busy with newspapers and case opinions. He paid attention to the slow collapse of the carting property rights system he had leaned on. A city commission gained power to deny licenses to firms linked to his world. A generation of haulers either cooperated with reforms or lost routes they had considered permanent. On Long Island, prosecutions against figures he had once relied on signaled the end of easy price fixing. In construction, the Windows prosecutions dented a scheme that had skimmed millions from public housing jobs. Those files were full of practices that looked like his style. Rotations, agreed prices, and labor kept smooth for a fee. Inside his old organization, his farewell instructions keep wars to a minimum, treat unions as partners, stay out of narcotics competed with a new, harsher tone. Men he had elevated leaned into fear as a management tool. That shift sparked desertions. Veteran earners who once counted on calm found themselves targeted or pushed out. Cooperation with law enforcement rose. Alphonse Darco's testimony took jurors through structures that had been in place when Corallo was boss. Peter Chiodo described how concrete jobs were divided and how labor leverage translated into dollars. Their accounts validated the portrait prosecutors had drawn with the tapes, turning his cautious voice into a framework for understanding the organization's finances and decision-making. He watched from a distance as the five families' council, once a stabilizing factor, effectively dissolved under the weight of arrests. A new generation paraded on front pages in tailored coats and gave quotable lines that fed the nightly news. He had never trusted that style. It made agents work easier. It rattled union allies who preferred discretion. It spooked contractors who wanted guarantees without attention. The old discipline that kept meetings small and quiet now looked, to him, like wisdom that no one wanted to inherit. There were still areas where echoes of his methods survived. Some unions instituted compliance programs, but the daily life of a city always left room for informal fixers. He recognized that, just as he recognized that long arcs favor law enforcement with time and resources. When you organize your world around avoiding microphones, a single successful wire changes everything. That practical lesson, learned late, became a cautionary tale repeated in debriefing rooms when investigators asked new witnesses to explain the culture that shaped them. They spoke of car rides, code words, and a preference for influence over displays of force. They described a boss who valued schedules, not spectacle. His health slowed him. Transfers put him in facilities designed for aging inmates with chronic conditions. The pace suited his temperament. He had never been a man who needed crowds. Visits were quiet, and conversations stayed measured. He asked after names he'd known for 50 years, some now dead, some retired, some living quietly under supervision. He did not indulge in bitterness. He understood the math of his sentence and the statistical shape of his remaining years. He pressed for appeals as long as lawyers saw openings, then accepted the plateau when courts said no. The broader picture of his life, seen through those clippings and through the testimony of former associates, is one of continuity. From his first steps in East Harlem to his last days in federal custody, he stuck to the belief that control over labor and logistics could be monetized indefinitely if you kept heat down and records thin. The charges he faced, bribery early on, and later racketeering built on extortion and fraud, captured the legal view of that belief. The practical view, held by people who needed jobs finished and trucks loaded, was that his crews sold a kind of order. That is why so many contractors paid even when they disliked the idea. The service worked. He had no fondness for drugs as a business. He saw what narcotics cases did to organizations: long mandatory sentences, relentless federal attention, and unpredictable partners. Betting and loans brought headaches, but they also brought regular cash without the same level of heat. Labor racketeering was better still. It delivered long-term relationships. He steered his people toward those lines and expected them to stick with the plan. For years they did, until prosecution teams built on new statutes and new investigative tools boxed the enterprise in. Looking back, you can see the hinge points: the decision to rely on cars for privacy, the success of the bug that turned those cars into tapes, the sweep of the bug, the commission trial, the shift to successors who handled pressure with fear instead of equilibrium, the reforms in carting and construction. Each step peeled away something he had built. Yet the fact that some pieces took years to dismantle speaks to how deeply they had been stitched into the city's routines. He had designed a system that hid in plain sight by making itself useful. That is why, even as cases mounted, some clients sighed rather than cheered. They had paid for certainty, and certainty is hard to replace. In the end, he was a study in restraint and reach. He rarely raised his voice, rarely embraced drama, and yet for decades his judgment affected how concrete flowed, how cargo moved, and how businesses handled waste. The crimes listed in his indictments, and proven at trial, were not bursts of violence. They were arrangements that bent markets in quiet ways that made life easier for some and more expensive for others. When the law finally translated those arrangements into a story a jury could understand, the consequence was total. He would live out his days under supervision, watching the city he had shaped become a place that no longer needed him to keep the gears turning. The cut and thrust of courtroom battles had faded, replaced by the low murmur of institutional life, but Anthony Corallo's mind stayed on the mechanics that had defined his career. He traced the shape of those mechanics in old union newsletters, in legal opinions clipped from newspapers, and in the small updates visitors brought during brief, supervised conversations. He was not a man for nostalgia. What he wanted to understand was how much of the operating system he had built still functioned without him, and how much had been rewritten by new laws, new prosecutors, and successors with a sharper taste for shorter-term pressure. He had always believed that the cleanest money came from the city's need to keep time. An airport could not afford confusion at a warehouse door. A crane crew could not stand idle while a batch plant argued with a contractor about delivery windows. A restaurant could not pile trash indefinitely behind a kitchen. He sold punctuality and calm disguised as labor relations and logistics consulting. That meant cultivating people who signed overtime sheets, approved dispatches, and controlled access to job sites. When he was young, those relationships were personal and small. As he rose, the network widened into a lattice woven through entire trades. That lattice made fortunes for a generation of earners, and gave him the confidence to speak in the measured, business-like tone heard on the tapes. His first lessons in discretion came from watching older handlers avoid unnecessary attention. They carried themselves like foremen, not celebrities, and they kept a strict separation between public life and the work that paid. He imitated that approach. He did not frequent headlineo-friendly night spots. He met in diners, at job trailers, and in cars that blended into city traffic. He preferred to route instructions through lieutenants who knew their craft. A steward who understood a contract clause better than most lawyers, a site superintendent who could interpret a delivery schedule in a way that rewarded friends and discouraged rivals, a carting dispatcher who knew which routes were practically off-limits because the trade association considered them spoken for. Every decision looked ordinary up close. The pattern showed itself only in aggregate. That pattern spanned decades. In the 1,940 seconds and 1,950 seconds, he learned the garment district's rhythms and the power of trucking lines that moved fabric, finished goods, and payrolls. In the 1,960 seconds, he leaned into municipal influence and paid for it with a prison term when a bribery case landed. On release, he tightened his circle and doubled down on low-WIA visibility leverage, crew chiefs at airports, batch plant schedulers, union business agents who could deliver manpower without noise. In the 1,970 seconds, when he took the top chair, he moved from being a skilled operator to a strategist. He pushed his people to make allies in the trades that turned blueprints into buildings and pallets into invoices. He knew the city's regulators watched the same industries. He also knew they had limited bandwidth. If he could keep his crews from creating scenes, oversight would lag, and contracts would roll forward. That calculus drove his resistance to ventures that attracted relentless attention. Dramatic robberies, for example, created more problems than they solved. They triggered task forces and emergency meetings, and they convinced honest supervisors that cooperation would bring ruin. He kept repeating the same advice. Earn every day, avoid press. Treat labor peace as a product with a price. The Jaguar recordings preserved that tone. Agents who listened later wrote that he sounded like a senior manager auditing operations. He asked for updates, identified gaps, and assigned responsibility. He discussed concrete bids, airport cargo lanes, and carting customer retention. He spoke about which union officials could be trusted to do what they promised. To his circle, that language was the normal grammar of hidden control. To prosecutors, it was the soundtrack to a racketeering enterprise that treated unions and vendors as instruments. In the courtroom, that contrast gave jurors a way to convert jargon into a verdict. From confinement, he tracked the wave of reforms that followed. In the carting world, city oversight bodies demanded disclosures that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Contracts that once ran on the trust of a handshake now required affidavits and background checks. Firms that had served the same neighborhoods for 20 years found themselves losing licenses if they could not explain their connections. The old property rights codes, never written, always enforced, buckled under civil racketeering suits and administrative bans. Executives who once nodded along with trade association rules pivoted to cooperation with investigators rather than risk their entire businesses. A quiet stream that he had treated as a perfect earner now ran shallow or diverted entirely. Construction brought its own reckoning. Investigations into municipal window replacements and housing projects put a spotlight on the way bids were steered and prices set. Prosecutors spelled out rotations, kickbacks disguised as consulting fees, and union leverage that created a price of peace. Jurors heard about local officers who sorted disputes in ways that favored companies tied to families. They saw how batches were allocated and how inspections could be slowed or sped up. Much of that matched the managerial approach he had insisted on. Solve problems calmly, share the market among a few, collect a percentage, and keep job sites quiet. The difference now was that each step lived in transcripts rather than folklore. Airports were harder to insulate once federal attention intensified. New rules changed how access badges were issued, how cargo areas were monitored, and how shrinkage was audited. Contacts in key locals still mattered, but the margin for quiet adjustments shrank. The more cameras and scanners appeared, the less room there was for informal fixes that made customers pay for reliability. Some of his old allies retired or were forced out. Others cooperated to reduce exposure. What had once been a dependable song of payrolls and pallets became a stop-a-when-start arrangement that never regained the old tempo. Inside his organization, the change in leadership style after his arrest produced a different kind of risk. Men who had benefited from his measured approach moved into hiding as paranoia and internal orders unsettled crews. Veteran earners broke ranks. Witnesses who had stood firm for years now explained details of construction rotations, carting practices, and airport arrangements to grand juries. The picture they drew reached back into the period when he had been boss, not because he had chased spectacle, but because the changes in law gave prosecutors the tools to make a long-standing pattern legible. He had avoided the glare for decades. The new climate made even careful operators visible. He accepted that he would not return to the streets. Appeals narrowed and ended. He settled into the routine of a federal medical facility, where age, not court dates, set the schedule. He walked when he could, kept to simple food, and read anything that tracked the city's industrial life. He asked after people he had known for half a century. Some were gone. Some lived quietly under supervision. Some had reinvented themselves entirely. The list of names became a census of a fading era. He had never believed that books or interviews refashioned reputations. He let the record stand as it had been made in courtrooms. That record showed a life spent turning the leverage of labor and logistics into revenue. It showed a bribery conviction from his middle years and a lady life conviction built on recordings and testimony about bid rotation, extortion masked as labor peace, and steady income from gambling and loans. It showed, too, a sustained attempt to keep violence and narcotics away from the center of his operation. He was not naive. He knew violence existed at the edges, and he knew crews sometimes drifted toward drugs. But he kept pushing his people toward safer streams, not out of moral zeal, but because it was good management. As the 1,990 seconds wore on, he watched the 5 families adapt unevenly. Some leaders tried to revive quiet rotations in construction and carting, only to run into monitors and joint task forces. Others slid into higher-risk ventures that delivered faster money and steeper penalties. The council that had once arbitrated disputes had been hollowed by convictions. Coordination gave way to smaller, more volatile arrangements. That shift reduced the predictability he had once sold to developers and shippers. When you cannot promise peace, the market pays less for promises. He reflected, without flourish, on his own hinge points. The bribery case had taught him to narrow his circle. The success of the car wire taught him that technology had outrun the old rules about where it was safe to talk. The commission case taught him that the law had developed a grammar for describing what had once been understood only by insiders. Those lessons were not philosophical. They were practical notes filed away by a man who had spent his life trading in practicalities. Even in a medical unit, he favored clarity over complaint. Visitors sometimes asked if he missed the street. He would shrug. The street he knew: garment trucks at dawn, airport foremen moving pallets by hand, batch plants sending out convoys of mixers toward Midtown, was already receding by the time the jury foreman read the verdict. Manufacturing moved, systems digitized, and oversight hardened. The business he ran had depended on human discretion at choke points. As those choke points became regulated processes, the room for quiet leverage closed. He had run his method as far as it could go. The world had changed its locks. Yet even with those locks, the story of his life remained instructive. It showed how a large city's daily needs could be channeled by people willing to map its routines and place allies at key points. It showed how influence could be exercised without headlines, how a calm voice could guide a complex operation, and how the same calm voice could become the keystone of a prosecution when technology flipped the advantage. It showed finally that a career built on avoiding spectacle could still end under bright lights, not because of a sudden lapse, but because the environment shifted around it. He did not pretend to be misunderstood. The indictments listed extortion, fraud, and conspiracy tied to labor racketeering, gambling, and loan operations. Those were the charges and the reality that produced the income he directed. He had chosen that path early and pursued it to the top. He measured success by steady cash, minimal arrests, and clients who paid for predictability. By those internal metrics, he had achieved what he set out to achieve, until the law found a way to define and prosecute that very predictability. Toward the end, the pages he turned in the library were more about health and the occasional headline than about commerce. He read obituaries of men he had once managed, and of men he had once negotiated with across tables. He noted the persistence of a few old tricks in new forms, and he smiled at the idea that every generation believes it invented discretion. He had lived long enough to know that habits outlast names, but only until law or economics redraws the map. His own map had been redrawn by statutes, wires, and a city that found it could do without his version of order. In that final quiet, he remained the same measured presence he had been in cars, in diners, and in back offices. He did not scold the next generation or romanticize the past. He kept accounts in his head the way he always had. He remembered who delivered when it mattered, who folded quickly, who understood that a schedule is more valuable than a speech. Those memories, unshared, were the only ledger he still held. The public ledger transcripts, rulings, headlines would carry his name forward as a case study in managerial racketeering. A man who turned labor calendars into revenue, avoided the loudest crimes, and fell when the silence he cultivated was recorded and replayed until it became a story a jury could hold in its hands. He spent long stretches cataloging how influence had been brokered across the city, not to reminisce, but to understand a system he once steered. He knew the names of batch plants, dispatchers, union halls, and trade offices as if they were subway stops. The routes between them formed the hidden map of his life. On that map, decisions traveled fast without leaving much trace. A steward's suggestion, a foreman's interpretation of a clause, a dispatcher's tweak to a rotation. He had shaped those routes so that business stayed smooth for people who paid and grew complicated for people who tried to go around deals. Years later, agents and prosecutors would reverse engineer that map with tapes, ledgers, and testimony. In private, he measured men by their handling of pressure. The ones he trusted did not brag, and they did not improvise when they could check a calendar. Salvatore Santoro fit that measure. He had a gift for labor politics at airports and construction sites. Christopher Fernari, steady and shrewd, settled disputes with a demeanor that kept tempers down. Crews under them handled the front-end money from bets and loans, while protecting the back-end money in transportation, concrete, and carting. He had no interest in controlling every storefront. He wanted a dependable cut of the trades that made the city run. He understood that alliances extended beyond his own house. the city's senior figures met as needed to prevent costly flare-ups. That practice, known as the Commission, functioned as a brake and a budget, defining who handled which sector and what share of large contracts would be diverted. He treated those conversations like board meetings. He did not pound tables. He argued for arrangements that would maximize calm because calm paid. When disputes arose over a supplier who took too many jobs, or a contractor who tried to evade an assessment, he favored sit-downs. A settlement with clear terms beat a feud that invited surveillance. He never believed secrecy rested only on code words. It rested on routines. He kept his meetings short and his circle small. He used cars because street noise and motion masked speech. He used early car phones and then rotated vehicles so that any one device could only do so much damage. For decades, that practice worked. He stayed a ghost on paper while still giving clear orders. The Jaguar changed that balance. Once agents installed a microphone under its trim, the very habits that had shielded him became conduits for evidence. The tapes caught the cadence that jurors would later hear. A calm supervisor, discussing schedules, splits, and trusted intermediaries. On those recordings, he treated labor leverage as a service with a price. He asked who could guarantee a crew on a Monday morning, who could smooth an inspection, who could keep a concrete pour on schedule despite weather or traffic. He spoke about which ready-do mix suppliers were in the rotation for large jobs and which had to wait for smaller pours. He identified air freight terminals where a fee bought reliability and terminals where oversight made adjustments risky. He asked whether a carting client trying to switch haulers could be coaxed to stay with a reminder about property rights. None of it sounded like a crime to someone who knew only the surface of city life. Prosecutors taught jurors to hear the undertone. Those fees were not optional. Those rotations excluded competitors. That reliability depended on knowing who pulled which union levers. He had lived through waves of attention before, but the 1,980 seconds brought a structured legal push that outpaced the evasive tactics of an older era. The commission indictment tied bosses and counselors from multiple families into one narrative. It included his name, Santoro's, and Fernari's, alongside counterparts from other houses. When Paul Castellano was killed in Midtown before trial, the case's cast shifted, but the strategy held. The evidence did not depend on a single witness who could be discredited. It relied on a weave of tapes, financials, and corroboration across trades. The weight of it pushed past his careful public image. He also knew that his house did more than concrete and carting. Gambling generated daily cash. Bookmakers took action on sports, horses, and numbers. Loan offices extended credit at rates that punished slow payers and rewarded punctual ones. Those lines fed crews and kept soldiers loyal. They also created points of contact with police. To limit risk, he delegated and kept those operations spread out. Arrests landed, as they always did, but the machine held as long as the larger Laboro Bay stream stayed steady. His view was simple. Short arrests could be managed if the core revenue sources were quiet. The portrait that emerged in court drew on cooperators who had worked under him, or under his successors. They described how a major concrete job would be allocated, how a percentage would be collected through padded change orders, and how union officials would discourage walkouts. They explained how a warehouse crew might move a valuable shipment through quickly for a favored customer, or how a business trying to change carting companies would encounter resistance. These were not fantasies. They were the daily mechanics of leverage. He had not invented them, but he had refined them into a plan that minimized chaos and maximized continuity. His approach to narcotics remained consistent. He saw drug traffic as a magnet for long sentences and federal task forces. He discouraged involvement and punished it when it threatened to compromise labor and logistics. That stance did not expunge drugs from the lives of men around him, but it reduced overlap between his core money and the highest risk ventures. When successors later embraced different priorities, the organization's arrest rate rose, and its ability to sell peace fell. He had predicted as much in private conversations, but predictions do not steer a ship when new captains take the helm. Across the river, the New Jersey wing that he had nurtured served as proof of concept for years. Its leaders earned from bookmaking, loans, and careful union ties. They stayed within their lanes, sent their cut without fuss, and kept headlines away. When state prosecutors tried to break that wing with a sweeping RICO case, the trial went on for months and ended with not a guilty verdicts for the top defendants. It shocked the state and emboldened the crew. He took it as confirmation that disciplined earning could withstand courtroom scrutiny when built without showy crimes. In time, however, pressure from his own successors upended that stability. Orders and suspicions sent men underground and splintered what had been a dependable operation. The erosion that followed undid more than a decade of steady results. While he adapted to prison life, the city rewired pieces of its economy. The carting business, long a bastion of unwritten rules, fell under a licensing system with criminal history screens and an integrity commission that could decertify firms. The effect was immediate. Prices dropped, long-term contracts were rebid, and the trade associations that once enforced property rights lost their bite. In construction, monitors looked over the shoulders of union locals, and reforms added layers of compliance that made off-book deals harder to sustain. At airports, improved security, new auditing systems, and federal oversight narrowed the room for quietly selling reliability. Old channels did not vanish overnight, but the key choke points became harder to influence with a handshake and a favor. Visitors told him about men he had known who now cooperated with the government. Alphonse Darco and Peter Chiodo were among the most damaging. They offered details that, combined with the Jaguar tapes, gave jurors a full picture of how rackets functioned during his tenure and after. They traced how money moved from a job site through middlemen to captains and up the chain. They explained the culture of sit-downs, the language of tribute, and the role of union allies. Those accounts, taken with financial records and recorded conversations, cemented the narrative that prosecutors had constructed. The neutral tone on the tapes did not help him. It underscored the thesis that modern racketeering looked like management. He did not indulge in self-pity when appeals failed. He had known men who broke under shorter terms. He kept routines and watched his health, choosing the boring path in a place where boredom could be a shield. He retained the same habits that had taken him this far. Rise early, keep notes in his head, read the news, and avoid unnecessary talk. He advised those who asked to value calm and to avoid gestures that gratified pride but endangered revenue. Whether anyone still listened was a separate matter. The world outside had less use for the skills he prized because systems had changed the balance between discretion and enforcement. From time to time, articles revisited the commission trial and its long shadow. Reporters summed up the era with a few names, a handful of social clubs, and a list of industries shaped by hidden pressure. They quoted trial transcripts where his car conversations became evidence. They described the concrete rotation that had steered major pours to a handful of suppliers that paid a percentage for peace. They detailed the window contract frauds that bled public housing budgets. They explained the carting property rights code that kept customers locked to haulers and inflated bills for decades. In those pieces, he figured as the exemplar of a boss who treated control over labor and logistics as a business model. The crimes were dry, almost bureaucratic. The damage to competition and public trust was real. He paid attention to the way courts discussed his case in later opinions. Judges used it to explain RICO's reach and to illustrate how a criminal enterprise could be proved through patterns rather than one explosive act. The rulings emphasized that steady extortion hidden in consulting could meet the statute's elements when tied to an organization with a defined structure and purpose. That legal legacy mattered beyond his life. It shaped how prosecutors would approach later cases in other cities, from construction to waste hauling to port operations. He had once believed that boring crimes were harder to prosecute. The law had learned to turn boring into a blueprint. He also knew that stories have a way of condensing complicated lives into a few signposts. People who had never set foot in a cargo terminal or stood on a gantry over a concrete pour still felt they knew what his era meant. Some saw an empire of shadow contracts that gouged the city. Others saw a system that, however improper, made schedules more reliable. He avoided those judgments. He kept to his practical lens. A city of moving parts can be guided if you understand who touches which lever. He had done that for half a century. The state learned to follow the levers and to make following admissible in court. As the 1,990 seconds and late 1,990 seconds passed, he depended more on medical units than law libraries. Time takes its due, even from men who planned every week of their adult lives. He accepted that he would never again sit across from a steward in a diner and map out a fix. The men who tried to imitate his style did so in a different climate. They faced monitors, databases, and cameras he never had to consider. Some adjusted, some did not. The result, either way, was that his template became a chapter in a past that still shaped a present. He thought often about the contradiction at the heart of his fall. He had built a method meant to erase traces, talk in motion, keep distance from paperwork, dress, crimes as services. Yet the microphone planted in a sleek car reduced that method to a stack of cassettes. Those tapes taught a generation of agents how to listen to mundane phrases and hear control. They also preserved the tone he valued, and that, in the end, made the case more persuasive. A raised voice might have sounded like a threat. A calm voice sounded like policy. Jurors chose policy as a crime when it used unions and contracts to extract money and exclude competitors. If you strip away the mythology, his life follows clean lines. A boy from East Harlem learned that reliability earns trust. A young earner learned that labor calendars hold power. A rising capo turned that power into a network that touched trucks, cranes, and carts. A boss condensed the network into rules and percentages that kept cash moving. A wire flipped his strengths into evidence. A trial named the system and imposed a sentence designed to end an era. The city enacted reforms that did the rest. He had chased predictability for decades. The only predictability left to him now was the rhythm of a facility where days blurred by design. He kept his bearings with a private inventory of lessons. Do not chase attention. Do not let pride decide a policy. Do not mistake a short-term surge for a plan. Place your allies where routines make them essential. Understand that the law, given time, will learn to describe what you do in ways jurors understand. Those lessons were not confessions. They were the distillate of a long operational life. Whether anyone would use them was not his concern. He had outlived many he had led, and many who had tried to catch him. Outliving is not the same as winning, and he did not confuse the two. Late in the day, he would sometimes look out a window that faced nothing in particular and imagine the city's old routes. Mixers moving through Midtown before dawn, forklifts beeping in cargo bays, carts clattering down alleys behind restaurants. Those sounds had been the metronome of his career. He had once set their tempo. Now they moved to a beat managed by regulators, market shifts, and new actors learning old moves in a less forgiving arena. The distance between that world and his room was measured not just in miles but in statutes, trials, and the hum of a hidden wire that changed how quiet sounds to a court. He had come up in a city of handshakes and ledgers, and he left in a city of databases and monitors. In those last years, Anthony Corallo measured the distance between those worlds by the way people talked about work. Once, a foreman would say a job was handled, and everyone understood what that meant. Later, the same foreman needed 3 forms: a compliance officer's approval, and a call to a hotline. He did not complain about it. He noted it the way a man notes the weather, a condition to be understood, not an argument to be won. The system that had made him effective, one where timing, discretion, and access could be priced, had been logged, taped, diagrammed, and used to convict him and many of his peers. He accepted that fact with the same understatement he had used to give orders. From the first years in East Harlem, his metrics had been simple: reliability, quiet earnings, minimal risk. He revived those measures in memory as an organizing tool. He thought about the garment shops that had once relied on dependable drivers and disciplined loaders. He thought about early mornings at the piers and, later, at airport bays, where a nod from the right steward could make a truck move while others idled. He remembered the meetings that kept buildings on schedule. Batching plants timed to pours, carpenters and ironworkers lined up by the day and hour, inspections that happened without friction. Those scenes, stitched together across decades, formed a pattern that seemed almost dull until you looked at the money. That was the point. Dull was safe, and safe paid. He had learned the price of ignoring that rule in the early 1960 seconds, when a bribery case against a city official landed him in federal custody for the first time. The shock was not the indictment. Arrests were occupational hazards. The shock was the sentence. He did the time, came home, and clipped off pieces of his public life. Fewer clubs, fewer rooms, shorter lists of people who could ask for a meeting. He doubled down on union influence and vendor access, not on splashy rackets. That adjustment set the course that would carry him through the next 20 years. Keep close to the trades that the city cannot pause, keep peace as a product, and make the price regular. When he took the top seat in 1973, that quiet plan was already built. He sealed it with personnel choices. Salvatore Santoro understood how locals at airports and concrete yards could become predictable machines. Christopher Furnari was a mediator who could turn arguments into terms. Captains spread across the boroughs and into New Jersey kept money arriving from wagers, credit, and the daily taxes on labor peace. He emphasized limits. He discouraged narcotics ventures because they drew the harshest penalties and permanent attention. He warned against 100-time scores that bought a day's glory and a year's scrutiny. He preferred the kind of influence that let a contractor's superintendent sleep at night, knowing crews would show and trucks would roll. Over time, that plan grew into the web prosecutors later mapped. The concrete rotation on major pours, the assessments disguised as consulting, the union allies who interpreted rules in ways that favored certain suppliers. These details turned up in testimony and on the recordings his car yielded. At airports, especially around the terminals served by Teamster locals that handled air freight, a fee meant fewer mix-ups. In private carting, long-standing property rights kept commercial customers tied to their haulers, and trade associations enforced the map of who served whom. Those arrangements had existed before him, but under his hand they became orderly, reliable, and lucrative. The car recordings changed the stakes because they made that order audible. In an era when the law had learned to describe patterns as crimes under racketeering statutes, the easy cadence of a seasoned manager became the heart of a case. He did not bellow on those tapes. He checked on rotations, asked who was trustworthy, discussed which bids should land where, and weighed how to resolve problems without flashing lights. Jurors, guided by witnesses who explained the terms of art, heard arrangements that excluded rivals and extracted payments in exchange for peace. The commission trial treated that system as the enterprise itself. His conviction and the century-long sentence that followed told him the old shield of quiet had failed. Even then, he tried to guide succession toward men who would prize stability. He backed Vittorio Amuso and Anthony Casso as a management solution when he could no longer be present. Messages sent through lawyers emphasized the same agenda. Keep the labor rackets healthy, avoid fights that bleed profit, collect on time. But authority changes when the chair changes. After the mid-1980 seconds, drives for bigger shares and stricter demands shook the organization. Long-time earners disappeared from their neighborhoods or sought safety by talking to agents. Alphonse Darco, who had served as acting boss, described operations from the inside to prosecutors. Peter Chiodo, a veteran in construction rackets, turned witness and walked jurors through rotations and percentages. Those accounts echoed back to Corallo's years, translating the logic he had refined into a set of facts a court could weigh. Outside, the city remade the markets he had favored. Carting fell under licensing regimes designed to screen out firms with hidden sponsors. A commission with power to deny or revoke permissions changed incentives overnight. Prices that had been fixed by habit were now set competitively, and businesses that once paid without question tested the market. In construction, reforms and monitors tightened oversight. Programs that had been soft targets for collusion, like public housing window replacements, became case studies for enforcement. At the airports, federal rules turned badges, access, and auditing into processes, with less room for informal adjustments. Locals still mattered, but the distance between a favor and a violation grew narrower. He watched those shifts from rooms, designed around routine rather than reach. He rotated through federal facilities as health required, spending his last years in a medical unit where the day moved at a measured pace. He kept the same personal discipline: early mornings, reading, quiet conversations within the rules. Letters and visits brought news of old hands gone, new arrests, and occasional acquittals that surprised almost everyone. He didn't try to manage from a distance. He had always believed management required presence. Without it, advice becomes a story, and stories don't balance books. From time to time, reporters revisited his name to frame the era. They paired grainy photos with his nickname and reduced a wide network to a few lines. A boss who avoided drugs, who focused on labor and logistics, who used a car as an office, who was recorded discussing the allocation of jobs and the price of peace. They listed the crimes proven at trial: extortion, fraud, conspiracy tied to industries that delivered essentials every day. They reminded readers that the commission case had finally made a theory concrete, that the city's dominant families met, divided spheres, and stabilized their own budgets through cooperation. In those accounts, his calm voice remained the emblem of a method that made illegality sound like policy. He saw, too, how his case continued to shape law. Courts cited the trial to show how patterns of influence can prove an enterprise, even when single acts look ordinary. They used it to explain pretrial detention for dangerous defendants in other matters and to justify aggressive use of racketeering statutes in sectors beyond New York. Agents played excerpts of his recordings in training rooms to teach new ears how to translate innocuous phrases into indicators of control. It was a strange kind of legacy. He had set out to make the daily operation as unremarkable as possible, yet the unremarkable had become a template. Not every thread of his life fit into neat lessons. Some parts held contradictions he did not try to resolve. He believed side agreements kept projects on schedule, yet those same agreements hollowed out competition and raised costs for the public. He believed discouraging narcotics protected his crews and reduced heat. Yet some men around him ignored the rule or drifted into violence that threatened the stability he valued. He considered himself a manager who sold reliability, yet the very reliability rested on pressure that the law, once organized to measure it, could not tolerate. He recognized these tensions in the abstract, but he did not chase them to philosophical ends. He kept to the practical: what worked, for how long, and at what risk. Old names resurfaced in the news, and he marked their ends the way bookkeepers mark balances. Thomas Lucchese had died long before. Carmine Tremonti's term had been brief. Leaders in other houses fell to cases or to internal ruptures. Some men he had worked closely with, like Santoro and Fernari, served long sentences derived from the same trial that had claimed him. Others survived to quieter years. The council that once served as a stabilizer was a memory. Coordination across houses happened, but not with the old certainty. He had been a product of that certainty and a supporter of it because it reduced risk. Without it, the city's underworld looked more like a battlefield. He had never tolerated battle when it could be budgeted. His personal life stayed out of the papers, as he had always intended. Family visited within the rules, and he kept those visits private. He did not dictate memoirs or grant interviews designed to adjust the story. He had spent decades keeping his voice out of public rooms. He saw no reason to reverse course. In any case, the narrative had hardened. Courts and archives held the record. The man on the tapes was how he would be remembered: even, precise, concerned with schedules and shares, not with theater. Late in the summer of 2000, age and illness did what prosecutors could not. He died in federal custody at a medical center maintained by the Bureau of Prisons, far from the city whose pulse had guided his adult life. He was 87. The news drew short notices, a few paragraphs summarizing his rise from East Harlem, his nickname, his years as boss of the Lucchese family, the car recordings, the commission verdict, and the long sentence that ended his time on the street. There were no crowds and no speeches. The quiet he had prized found him at the end. What remained after him were reforms set in motion in response to the methods he had practiced. A city agency stood between carting firms and customers, with licensing powers that outlasted mayors. Construction oversight tightened on high-value contracts, and monitors became standard on projects with public money. At airports, heightened security and federal presence constrained the old informality of cargo movement. Union cultures evolved under watchful eyes, with ethics officers and compliance teams inserted where business agents had once operated alone. None of these measures eliminated corruption, but they reshaped the terrain in ways that made it harder to sell the old brand of certainty. His name endures in a narrow way. As shorthand among investigators for managerial racketeering, and among historians for the moment when a secretive council faced a public reckoning. People who never learned the difference between a batch plant and a barge still recognize Tony Ducks as a byword for a careful man who avoided the spotlight until a microphone carried his voice to a jury. That is not the story he would have chosen to tell, but he would have understood why it lasted. Cases are built on repetition patterns of payment, recurring roles, a cadence that doesn't vary. The same repetition that made his world profitable made it visible when recorded, transcribed, and replayed. You can draw a line from the boy who ran errands in East Harlem to the older man who reviewed construction calendars from the back seat of a luxury car. Along that line, the same qualities show up again and again. Punctuality, restraint, a preference for process over performance. He mapped influence to schedules and access points, and turned that map into income through unions, vendors, and trade associations. He avoided the edgiest trades, knowing the penalties they drew. He treated conflict as a cost center and cut it when he could. He prospered for years, and then the tools of law enforcement caught up with his method. In a sense, he had been right about everything that mattered in his world until the rules of the larger world changed. For the people who study that period, his life is a reminder that power in a city often sits in the space between the necessary and the optional. Trucks must run. Concrete must cure on time. Trash must be hauled away. Whoever can smooth those necessities earns a premium. For decades, he captured that premium. The lesson for the other side came later. If you trace routines, follow who grants access, and document the conversations that translate leverage into money, you can undo a system without catching a man in the act of a single sensational crime. That shift from chasing headlines to proving patterns defined the cases that closed his career. In the end, he stood for a kind of order that made money by making chaos less likely. It worked because it matched the city's need to keep moving. It failed because it rested on leverage that the law, once equipped to measure it, could not allow. He left behind no speeches and no defenses, only a record that shows a leader who prized calm, who learned the value of labor calendars and access passes, who rose by keeping his voice low, and who fell when that low voice filled a courtroom. The city went on, as it always does, with new buildings and new contracts and new players learning old lessons in a new light. His chapter closed in a quiet room far from the roots he had known, a final expression of the restraint that had defined him, and a closing note in a long story about how a metropolis learned to hear the sound of quiet control. And that was the story of Anthony Corallo Tony Ducks, the quiet strategist who led the Lucchese family with patience, influence, and a talent for slipping through the cracks of justice. His empire, once built on silence and calculation, now lives only in history's memory. Thank you for joining me tonight, here at the Silent Empires. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach. And if you haven't yet, subscribe so you never miss another tale of gangsters and the empires they left behind. Now rest easy, let the silence surround you, and good night.